Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome from Central European University's Democracy Institute. My name is Renáta Uitz. I'm one of the co-directors of DI, and I also teach comparative constitutional law at CEU in Vienna. We are welcoming you for a high-level debate on the future of constitutionalism and the rule of law in Hungary with a panel who barely deserve an introduction, but my role actually is to make some introduction for the purposes of those who might be joining us late. So at the center and in alphabetic order, we will have Péter Márki-Zay, who is currently the mayor of Hódmezővásárhely and the candidate of the United Opposition for the Hungarian elections in April. He was selected as a United Opposition candidate in an unprecedented two-round primary organized by the opposition parties. And he does have plans for constitutional change to return Hungary to constitutional democracy. Next of the panelists in alphabetic order is Professor András Sajó, one of the founding fathers of CEU. He is currently a university professor at CEU, also teaching at the Department of Legal Studies. Professor Sajó is also a research affiliate at DI and the former vice president of the European Court of Human Rights. He has served as an advisor on several constitution-making processes during the third wave of democratization. The next is, in alphabetic order still, Professor Scheppele, who is the Laurance Rockefeller Professor of Sociology and International Affairs in Princeton at the School of Public and International Affairs and also at the University Center for Human Values and at Princeton University. She is a founding mother of CEU's Department of Gender Studies and a scholar on constitutional transitions and an expert on Hungarian constitutional developments. She is a tireless critic of the EU's lukewarm response to the rule of law crisis and an advocate of systemic infringement action to defend the founding values of the Union. The last member of the panel is Michal Šimečka, who is the vice president of the European Parliament. He is a member of the Renew Europe group and the Progressive Slovakia Party. In 2020, he was labeled as Mr. Rule of Law for championing a resolution that demanded a legally binding, effective mechanism to protect EU values, a resolution which was adopted by a sweeping majority in Parliament. During the debate on the proposal, he said that this discussion is really about the very future identity of the EU as a democratic peace project. The debate will be moderated by Ben Novak, a journalist with exceptional insight and expertise on Hungary. His long piece in the New York Times in January 2022 with Stephen Erlanger was titled "On How the EU Allowed Hungary to Become a Neoliberal Model." It's a must read and you will be in safe hands as the discussion kicks off.
Well, thank you for that, Renáta. Hi, everybody. My name is Benjamin Novak. I am a reporter based here in Hungary. We're here to discuss the future of constitutionalism and the rule of law in Hungary. So what do we know about the opposition's plans, and how do those plans sit with legal experts? What can this debate tell us about the future of the rule of law and constitutionalism in Hungary? And what does the EU have to do with all of this? So our speakers will each make brief introductory remarks, after which we will engage in a discussion. Then we'll open the questions to the audience. I encourage those of you watching on Facebook or the stream to put your questions in the comment section. And as I am forwarded those questions, I'll do my best to put them to our panelists. So let's begin with our intros. First, we will have András Sajó speak. Then we'll move to Scheppele, then to Michal Šimečka, and we'll wrap up the introductions with Péter Márki-Zay. András, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I would like to welcome the audience and really privileged to be in this group of experts and practitioners. Allow me to say a few words about the current situation of the rule of law in Hungary and the problems generated by it in order to put into a frame the forthcoming discussion. This situation in Hungary is characterized by the current state of the law. And this current state of the law is something of a variation on what occurs in or occurred in Latin America, where there is a saying that I make the law and you find your way around it or work around it. Now in Hungary, the situation is different because here first the workaround is found and then the workaround is written into the law, so it will be lawful. To quote the title of a recent book, it's ruling by cheating. Now this system of abuse is constitutionally protected by the existence of so-called cardinal laws, laws that require a 2/3 majority in parliament in order to be amended. Assuming that the opposition comes to power, this 2/3 majority will cause certain difficulties for any change, because it's very unlikely that, assuming that the current opposition wins, there will be a 2/3 majority. Now, let me present, and by the way, there are at least 35 areas, very important areas of law, which require 2/3 majority. I would like to give you an example, and that is secret surveillance. It's quite well known that in the Pegasus affairs, a number of businessmen, journalists were surveyed, wiretapped, using their telephone with this spy program. The European Court of Human Rights found that the law that enables this kind of activity is contrary to the Human Rights Convention. So far, this has not been changed, and this lack of change enabled the government to carry out this kind of surveillance. Now imagine that after the elections, there will be an intent to end this kind of activity. Now, of course, you can say that the government can always stop it by government decree or just telling the responsible minister not to allow it, but that's not an assurance to citizens. The issue is what happens to citizens, what kind of guarantees the law offers to citizens. So you need to change that. Again, it is not out of question that the then parliamentary minority will vote for it, because it will be in their best interest not to have such a system that they enjoy so far. But again, that cannot be taken for granted. So what happens, the only way to amend this law is to enact a law by a simple majority. Because the law is enacted by simple majority, the President of the Republic will have a constitutional duty under the fundamental law to submit it to the Constitutional Court. The Constitutional Court, under the existing rules, has no choice but to declare the law enacted by simple majority to be unconstitutional, even assuming that otherwise they would really love to endorse the position of the European Court of Human Rights, which, by the way, they did not accept or they did not consider to be relevant in 2013. So first you have to assume that this same court will go against its own judgments, but even if they would go against their own judgment, they can't do that because the 2/3 requirement is not present. And lawyers are trained to be formalistic. I would like to add that that is not the only perspective a society may take. So that's what happens. Under these circumstances, because of the Constitutional Court and for other reasons, the public prosecution are considered by many to be an obstacle of this return to constitutionalism and the rule of law, they feel threatened, and the president of the Hungarian Constitutional Court begged or asked the president of the Republic, the prime minister, etc., to provide protection against all these attempts to change the Constitutional Court and the judiciary in general. And I must say that this position of the president of the Constitutional Court is perfectly reasonable because it is a fundamental consideration of the rule of law that because of the importance of judicial independence, judges cannot be removed. He also said that court packing, adding additional judges, is not acceptable, but he forgot that the current Hungarian Constitutional Court was created by one of the first laws of Fidesz, which enabled or authorized court packing. So I cut this long story short because there are many other issues to discuss. And I would like only to mention that although judicial integrity requires irremovability, most recently, the European Court of Human Rights came to the conclusion that even in the absence of a manifest breach of domestic law, a violation is possible, since a procedure that is seemingly in compliance with the rules may nevertheless produce results that are incompatible with the object and purpose of judicial independence. So at the end of the day, this is not only a question of formalistic legalism. There are ways to give a broader understanding of the rule of law. And I think the European Court of Justice and the European Court of Human Rights do recognize now, perhaps very late, this possibility. So I stop here and thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, András. Kim?
Great, thank you. And thank you to everyone for being here. Thanks to the organizers. Thanks to András for kicking us off so well. So I agree. I want to pick up where András left off and to say that one way to understand the rule of law is that there are rules in law and everyone must follow them. Another way to understand rule of law is that it is an attitude toward a system, which is to say that no one is above the law, that laws are enforced equally in a population that has generated willingly the government that creates those laws. And already, I think one of the characteristic signatures of the last 12 years in Hungary is that the Fidesz government has consistently put itself above the law by constantly changing the law whenever it wants. So what this is befuddled European institutions, I'm afraid, because the European institutions look at the law and they say, everything looks formally legal. But of course, everyone has been living in a world in which the Fidesz government can wake up one morning, decide the Constitution is inconvenient, and by the next evening, it has already changed it. That is not living under the law. That is using the law essentially as a weapon against their enemies and instrumentally to achieve the purposes that they want. So we're not in a rule of law system in Hungary for that reason. Now, the question is, what an opposition government can do coming in when it is faced with this kind of legal prison, or, since we're in the middle of a pandemic, we might say a legal lockdown, right? In which no one is allowed to leave the house of the law that has been created under this system. And here is where, I'm midway between saying illegitimate law has no value and saying, the rule of law must be followed in the sense that there is a certain predictability and certainty created by having rules in place. So how do we reconcile these two? Well, here I think it's important to say that European law, and I mean both EU law in the formal sense and Council of Europe law in the sense of adherence to especially the European Convention on Human Rights, European law can be Hungary's friend. So let's think about it this way. Hungary is actually currently living under two broad legal regimes. One is the Fidesz legal regime in which everything has been created for the benefit of the governing party. And the other is a system of European law that Hungary has signed onto by treaty. Okay, now here's a small technical point. I don't want to get lost in legalese. But when Hungary joined the EU and when Hungary joined the European Convention on Human Rights, it did so with two-thirds laws, which is to say in the Hungarian domestic legal system, those treaties count as two-thirds laws. So for many of these two-thirds laws, for all the two-thirds laws that Hungary has passed, you've got a Fidesz law that says one thing and an international law in Hungarian, that was absorbed into the Hungarian domestic legal system that says something else. So what this means is that you have what lawyers would call a conflict of laws problem. One law says go left, another law says go right. Okay, and when you have a conflict of laws problem, what a lawyer does is to say, which law gets precedence, right? And so here too, standard Hungarian legal doctrine with no change gives us an answer, which is treaties are always higher than domestic statutes. And that's true regardless of whether the statute, the law passed by parliament, is a 2/3 law or an ordinary law. So here's the germ of a kind of answer. In the cases where one of the treaties that Hungary has signed on to conflicts with the domestic law, you don't even have to go out to the supremacy of European law. All you have to do is say there's a tension between two laws in the Hungarian legal system, which the Hungarian legal system tells you means that the treaty takes precedent over the 2/3 laws. Now, here is where I think you can actually make a lot of progress, because then when the parliament acts to change the Fidesz law, what is it doing? It may be acting by simple majority in the instant case, but it's acting by simple majority to enforce another 2/3 law. And again, it's a little bit of a sleight of hand. It's true that the Constitutional Court might not go along with it, but it's not a non-legal argument, right? It's a rule of law argument designed to say, a new government could say, what we are going to be doing is now making Hungarian domestic law broadly consistent with the European commitments that Hungary has made by 2/3 laws of our parliament. And so, for example, in the case that András mentioned, the Sabo and Vichy case out of the European Court of Human Rights, that said that TEC, the anti-terrorism police's unlimited surveillance capacities, violated the European Convention because it had no limits. That law has not been changed. If it would take a 2/3 vote to change it, hence, this is the legal lockdown. But what if the parliament were to say, well, look, the European Convention, as authoritatively interpreted by the Court of Human Rights, has told us that we have to change this law. To comply with the 1/2 law, the European Convention, we must change the other 2/3 law. And under those circumstances, we will say we can do it by majority, because all we're doing is giving voice to 1/2 law over another, the very 2/3 law that Hungarian law tells us we have to prioritize. Okay, so this is, you can go step by step through a lot of the decisions directly about Hungary, like Sabo and Vichy, or you can also, because it's in the spirit of taking on board what the authoritative interpreters of these treaties have said about what they mean. And you could also take on board indirectly some of the provisions, let's say EU law. So for example, Poland, which has also infringed the independence of the judiciary, just as has happened in Hungary. Now, Poland has done it rather inartfully. They've taken a battering ram, to the independence of the judiciary. And the European Commission has come in and brought infringements actions. There's a big jurisprudence on the part of the ECJ about what it takes to guarantee judicial independence. Those cases do not yet apply directly to Hungary. Hungary's not a party. But what a new parliament could do is to say, what do those Polish decisions mean for our courts? And then use the same provision in order to try to increase the independence of the judiciary. My time is up, but what I just want to say is that I think this is a legal avenue for getting out of the legal box. And if the Constitutional Court objects, then you go to the Court of Justice and you try to get a direct decision. But basically, I think this is something that does not ignore the rule of law, but rather brings about a rule of law that everyone can live with as a general principle. Thank you.
Thanks, Kim. Michal?
Thank you very much, Ben. And just to say at the very beginning that it's an immense privilege and honor to be at this panel, and I would like to thank the CU for the invitation. And I should just say that I'm not a lawyer, maybe in a minority here, but I'm a politician, and therefore also my introductory remarks won't be as structured and legally rigorous as of course the professors before me. Let me just start by saying that which kind of is probably obvious to everyone, but should be said, is that the debate that we're having now and that's unfolding in Hungary over what to do, how to dismantle a liberal regime and using it within the confines of the rule of law is immensely consequential for everybody, not just Hungary. First of all, because the elections themselves are absolutely crucial for the entire European Union, and also for my country, Slovakia, for the entire region. I think they are the most important elections this year in the EU, if not beyond. And we can go into the reasons, why, but I feel it especially in neighboring Slovakia that this will reverberate across the region and either strengthen the populist nationalist pro-Russian in this case forces, or on the other hand provide a momentum for the pro-European democratic forces in Slovakia and Poland and elsewhere. I also should mention, although it's also obvious to everybody, how consequential this is for the entire European Union and its existential challenge of defending rule of law, fundamental rights, and democracy among its own member states. And it's obviously consequential for the geopolitics of our region and the role of the EU in the international arena, given kind of the role of a spoiler that Orban regime is playing. So because it's so consequential, what will happen after what I hope would be a win by the opposition, what would happen after is also going to be extremely carefully watched by everybody else. And the steps, also legal and political, that any future government will make to dismantle or to try to dismantle the liberal regime could be used and will be used in a propaganda war all across Europe, because precisely if there is an attempt to overcome or to overpower these two-thirds laws with a simple majority and to do it the hard way, that would be water on the mills for all the propaganda, the disinformation, and all the trolls everywhere. And they would just say, look, I mean, this is these are not real Democrats, and this is all just revenge, or it's driven by partisan politics, and basically the conclusion would be that there isn't anything as a rule of law standard, because everything is malleable and everything is political. So I think that's why this debate in Hungary is important for I would even say globally. And my sense, also listening to Professor Sayo and to Kim Scheppele, is that indeed that caution is kind of warranted. And I also think that the EU's perspective, obviously without prejudging what the Parliament or the Commission or other institutions would be, how they would be reacting, but obviously the European Union would have to be fairly legalistic or strict on rule of law and whether it's observed. And of course, there is still this issue of conditionality, which would probably not be resolved before the elections, and will be is to be resolved after the elections. And that it would also depend on what steps perhaps the new majority in Parliament takes. So for all these reasons, and also for reasons of precedent, I would urge perhaps caution, or that's kind of my political view at the moment. And the kind of argument that Professor Scheppele is making is also sounds very appealing and attractive to me, that even if there is no direct case law of the European Court of Justice which could be applied and could bolster the legitimacy of dismantling the two-thirds laws or changing them at the moment, you can always take that recourse. You can always ask the European Court of Justice, which obviously the Fidesz government or the Fidesz judges were very reluctant to do. I mean, this might change with a new majority in Parliament. So you can actually actively ask the European Court of Justice to give judgments or verdicts or clarifications on many of these two-thirds laws, and there your argument would be all the stronger. But that's all for me now. Thanks so much, and I'm really looking forward to Mr. Márki-Zay's take on the matter.
Thank you, Michal. Peter?
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's my honor to be in this very distinguished company. I'm also not a lawyer. I'm a politician. I'm not a politician by trade. Of course, I only turned to politics 4 years ago, and I'm an economist by trade. And for me, I totally understand your discussion concerns and arguments. I'm very curious about it. But for me, this is not a theoretical, but a very pragmatic question. So there is a big if, of course, about the April 3rd elections. If we can defeat Fidesz at this election, will Fidesz still rule this country, or can the new government actually make significant changes? Because if we accept and if we take it for granted that this elaborate system of two-thirds laws and constitution or basic law will continue to provide Fidesz with the power to overcome the current day opposition, but even a future government, then criminals will not go to court. They will not go to prison. Then independent radio stations will not get licenses or frequencies even in the future. Then Fidesz will still rule this country. And in a very short period of time, they can come back, not only come back, but they can even, basically with a coup, change government and return to power. But not for a moment. They will release power, in fact, if we do not find a way to solve this huge problem, this situation that they pretty much, like I said, this elaborate system of different laws will provide them with, the ultimate power, even if they are not in government, even from the opposition. They occupied all independent institutions. They secured a 9-year term for the head of the media council. They were afraid that they might actually lose the elections and be out of government. So they forced the head of the media council in December to step down so that they can appoint another very loyal Fidesz member for 9 years, for the next consecutively 9 years, overlapping the entire 4-year electoral cycle, to head the media council, so that even if they lose the elections, they will still rule the entire media in Hungary. And just so that I can emphasize the gravity of the situation, there is a media council that consisted of 5 people, all of them Fidesz appointees and Fidesz loyals. And there's not a single radio station, FM radio station, that belongs to the opposition or that does not belong to Fidesz. There's a few independent ones, maybe 3, in this country of 10 million people. And this is just one example. Of course, state media is another segment. All daily regional newspapers, all of them belong to Fidesz. They are in one Fidesz empire. But I could go to the judiciary, of course. They occupied already all positions, not only the Constitutional Court, but also the head of the Supreme Court, or the third level of the judicial system here in Hungary, and we could go on and on. So they already, occupied this country. They can still rule if we cannot find a legal way of restoring democracy. And I also emphasize what somebody already said, that there is nothing to worry about. If somebody worries about the freedom of the press, the first thing that we have to do is dissolve this media council and liberate the press in Hungary. Otherwise, there will be no freedom of the press. Same thing with rule of law. If we insist that all Fidesz made laws, constitutional, be kept not in spirit but to the word, then there definitely won't be a rule of law country in Hungary, even after the elections. So yes, we have to declare. And our logic, and it's not mine, of course, it's Flex Zoltán, Vörös Imre, Róna Péter, Elek István, Bárándy Péter, so quite a few well-known jurists. They explained in their writing, probably from May last year, that since even in Fidesz's constitution, the so-called basic law, contains a sentence that anything that is aiming to secure the power, the monopolistic power for a party or for an individual is unconstitutional and invalid, we can pretty much cancel all those stipulations in the current legal system that are there to give Fidesz the ultimate power, even if they lose the election. So anything that was deliberately made to secure this power to Fidesz are invalid. And we have to come up with a new solution. Our solution just in case we won't have a 2/3 majority, would be write a new constitution and approve it by a referendum. That's a proposal, but we are of course open to any other kind of legal solutions for a very pragmatic, not theoretical problem.
Thank you, Peter. I want to start off here by kind of throwing out a very broad question, because we've gotten really into the nuts and bolts of law and legalism here. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts on where does a constitution in a modern representative democracy derive its legitimacy from? I'd like to, if maybe András, if you could start off by answering that question.
So the traditional answer to that is that the legitimacy comes from people's will. People is the sovereign, has the constituent power. The difficulties begin when you have to determine who people are, who is the people. And I don't want to enter into that debate, because you rightly warned us not to be too theoretical. But that's the standard answer. And there are approximations to the will of the people. A process that involves a society that enables participation, that is ratified through referendum. These are signs that this really reflects popular will. On a more sociological level, there is generally a relative minority behind any constitution. Certainly the basic law was enacted by a parliamentary supermajority, which was elected by 1/3 or so of the electorate. So in such cases, what gives legitimacy other than participatory acceptance, which in this case is more than dubious? Well, people acquiesce in a constitution. They find that the constitution offers them a form of living together. And that's what they basically accept at a social level, that it works, that it's efficient, that conflicts are not increased but diminished, that it accommodates. It's a form of living together. So that's a form of social acceptance, or reason for social acceptance. And that must correspond to certain fundamental moral principles shared by the society.
Peter, when you, in your introductory remarks, you mentioned the Media Council, but I'm curious here, can you specify for me and for our audience whether the opposition, the united opposition going into this election, has concrete plans for addressing this simple majority 2/3 subject? So do you plan to use a simple majority to tinker with or adjust any 2/3 laws in Hungary?
Well, by our logic, Fidesz was already unconstitutional when they cemented their very loyal representatives into key positions in preventing the opposition from winning and preventing a change of power. And it was already unconstitutional. In a normal society or state, the Constitutional Court should have declared these measures unconstitutional and invalid and cancelled them. Well, a Fidesz-backed Constitutional Court failed to do so, but it doesn't mean that it would have not been right to do so. So our argument is that we don't even need a 2/3 majority to declare current constitutional phrases, sentences, points, stipulations in law, appointments invalid. So we are just doing the Constitutional Court's job, which they failed to do when we declare that these were invalid. And our solution is not to override 2/3 laws by simple majority, but our logic says that if we can come up with a solution, which is a new constitution, and this constitution, if approved by a referendum, that one is stronger than a 2/3 majority in a parliament.
So, yes or no? Will you be using a simple majority to? No, you will not.
No,
you mentioned.
Again, it's a very logical statement that we just declare already, even before the elections, that any such moves from the Fidesz-led parliament that is there to secure Fidesz's unlimited power and infinite power, meaning that we cannot replace them, is unconstitutional. Yes, Fidesz will not declare this, but we can already. We already did this. We know exactly which phrases, which points, which appointments are unconstitutional. We just state the obvious, that these measures were unconstitutional and invalid. And in order to right the wrong, one of our first steps should be to approve a new constitution. And in this new constitutional system, we can already solve most of these issues.
You mentioned here that many of the steps that the Fidesz government had taken were already unconstitutional. Do I understand you correctly? Are you implying here that the Constitutional Court of Hungary is illegitimate?
Well, it's just not doing its job. And even Fidesz actually limited their power. So again, I'm not a lawyer, not a jurist, but it's very obvious that Fidesz has already limited the number of subjects the Constitutional Court can say their opinion on. So it's already a very limited scope Constitutional Court, and in many instances, Fidesz already proven themselves that they don't regard this Constitutional Court as the highest authority in such questions. They even limited its powers. So it's very obvious that if this Constitutional Court otherwise did not prevent certain laws from taking into effect, they just failed to do their job.
Thank you. András, Kim, how do you see the Hungarian Constitutional Court in this situation?
Well, let me take a stab at this. So one way to think about how to do this legally is to again look at what the European institutions are doing. We already have a decision of the European Court of Human Rights that has found that the Polish Constitutional Court is not a court within the meaning of a court in European law. Now, the Polish Constitutional Court was packed very overtly, but so was the Hungarian court. So one way to look at this is to say, and if we want, we can try to get a ruling of the Court of Human Rights, or for that matter, of the European Court of Justice, which I think is also close to saying the same thing about the Polish Constitutional Court, to say the Hungarian court is also not a court in law, under European law. So if that were the case, then it seems to me that none of the decisions of that court are binding on the Hungarian government. You could just start there. But the other thing you could do, one thing I can't say I've enjoyed, but that's been interesting about following Fidesz developments in the last 12 years, is that they've provided a whole blueprint of ways you can be legalistic and win. So, what happened in the early days of Fidesz consolidation was they just create a parallel institution and transfer powers to that. That's what they did with the data protection officer, for example. So what if the new parliament creates a parallel constitutional court? And so because it's in the Constitution, and you could create a parallel court, given that the European courts have already said this court is not a court, or at a minimum, you could get rid of all the judges who are in a court that's not a court. In other words, if you lean on European law, it gets you around some of the problems in Hungarian law.
Thank you. András?
Well, as a former judge, I would be very reluctant to pass judgment on other colleagues. I mentioned court packing, but you remember that a good Democrat by the name of Roosevelt had the same ideas in a crisis situation. So all I can say, there is a standard now developing or emerging. And if there is a pressing need of a substantial and compelling character that justifies the departure from this principle of irremovability, then it is appropriate to consider them being not part of a court of justice. Whether this argument stands in a court, it's very hard to predict, but what I really would like to say that, if I may, that there is a time problem here. It takes, let's assume that there is a solid case along those lines, goes to the European Court of Justice, Luxembourg, European Union Court, or to Strasbourg, which may have less impact according to the existing law. It takes, in the best case scenario, 18 months. And, you know, let's assume that the new government comes to power in April, May, whatnot. Case is submitted 2 or 3 months later. Then there is a 2 years gap. So what happens in that period, I don't know. What I really would like to say, and I would like to use this opportunity here, is to stress that a certain European perception has to be changed, that the rigid concept, a legalism-based concept of the rule of law shall not apply, that it has to be understood that the rule of law here was used to destroy the rule of law, to create opportunities to abuse it. And if you, as a European legal authority or political authority, claim that the standard rules of the rule of law shall apply without understanding what happened here, how the rule of law turned against itself, became a tool of self-destruction. If you continue to apply the traditional and reasonable standards, then you do not do a good service to the rule of law in the name of its protection. So it's first of all a problem of understanding of the situation and calibrate your answer according to that. That's, to me, is the crucial issue for understanding, both domestically, to move out of this legalism that prevails here, and in Europe, when they apply their own rule of law rules. For the Court of Justice in Luxembourg, it took a very long time to understand it, and I still don't know how far-reaching this understanding is.
We are talking. We've established a solid background for how you all see the current situation in Hungary, but this discussion is about the future of the rule of law and constitutionalism in Hungary. Peter, I'd like to ask you, how do you write you mentioned putting it to referendum, putting a constitution to referendum. How do you put a constitution? How do you write a constitution based on the will of the people in such a highly polarized society? How do you hope to accomplish that?
I understand this is extremely difficult, I have to admit. We already established a group of experts led by Flex Zoltán to come up with proposals. I actually asked them to prepare this new proposal for a new constitution by the end of January, which obviously did not happen. And there is a significant level of difference in opinions among these scholars, also on a personal level, but also on a theoretical or professional level. So it proved to be a very difficult job to complete. And but regardless, my proposal, for the same reason, was a minimalist constitution, which focuses on checks and balances, so that it cannot happen again what happened after 2010 with Orbán Viktor, that he switched off all checks and balances pretty much and occupied Hungary as a whole. He derailed democracy, he derailed rule of law in Hungary by this act. So what I would personally suggest to our lawyers, jurists, is to come up with a very simple new constitution that just focus on the limitations on power, checks and balances.
This discussion we're having, has dealt a lot. Kim brought up this EU angle, EU law angle. But if we assume for a moment that the opposition loses the upcoming election, and Fidesz wins with a simple majority and is nowhere near a 2/3. And if we assume that the Court of Justice will dismiss this case that was brought by Hungary and Poland to challenge the rule of law conditionality, it stands to reason, one may assume, that the Commission will start applying a bit of pressure on Hungary in cases it feels rule of law issues that threaten the financial sound financial management of the EU budget. Could it be that external factors from the EU, independent of what you had all mentioned here, could nudge Viktor Orban to work with the opposition in correcting some of what you guys have seen as imbalances in the rule of law? I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that. Kim?
Yeah, so I think it's actually quite likely that if the opposition doesn't win, that Orban will only get a simple majority. And then suddenly he will find himself trapped in this legal prison that he has created. And moreover, he will be trapped in this legal prison, and the Commission does seem finally to be recognizing what's happening in Hungary and moving forward with this so-called conditionality regulation, which will result in funds being cut to Hungary. So here's my here's my problem. What you can see is that Orban is already running up a huge deficit. I mean, as are many member states because of COVID, but the Hungarian debt in the current budget is enormous. And Orban has promised a lot of things which will increase that deficit. And if the EU conditionality regulation kicks in and Hungary doesn't get the EU funds, and if the provision of the tax code goes through, where if a Hungarian donates money to these new private foundations, all the universities, except a few, run by Orban's friends, and then they get 3 times that amount a tax deduction from their taxes, it looks to me like Orban is setting up the country to go bankrupt after this election. Okay, now I don't know how much of that he can pull back, but I'm worried he's setting a trap if the opposition wins. And so what I hope is that the EU is thoughtful enough to recognize when it's thinking about the conditionality regulation that one of the criteria they have to apply is the government willing to fix things, right? And that's where, Orban won't get the money to bail himself out from this trap he's put himself in unless he shows a willingness to fix things. So he may get desperate enough to do it. And this is where, and I'm hoping that if the opposition wins, the EU will recognize that government will be willing to do it. But I think as we look forward, we're focusing on the law here, but we also need to focus on the finances because Orban's prison is legal, but it's also financial. And I'm worried that he's setting a trap for the opposition. So here's one last thing I want to say. Orban may be planning to lose this election and leave the opposition stuck with a bankrupt state. And in the Constitution, there's a trap door through which he can come back in less than 4 years. I won't explain it, it takes too long. What I'm concerned about is he's setting up the opposition to fail financially while we're all here debating law. And then he will swoop back in and say, you see, the last time the opposition was in charge, they went bankrupt too. And then he will get reelected forever, right? So I'm hoping everybody thinks about finances as well as law.
Hey.
Peter.
Hey, just to reassure Kim that Orban is not planning to lose the elections. I can guarantee that, not only from what he's doing right now and from all the smear campaigns, hate campaigns, the huge, and you're right, there is a huge financial crisis now, and Orban is making it a lot worse. Orban is now using about 8% of the GDP for a campaign, an election campaign, basically. You know, he is giving tax credits to families, tax reductions to 0 to people under 25, a 13 months pension for all the pensioners, all the retired people. And I could go on and on with all the increases. Inflation is high, so of course increases are necessary, pay increases, salary increases, but it's also a little bit to catch up with what he forgot to do for 12 years. So anyway, altogether, it's you're absolutely right. But one thing is certain, that he's not risking losing this election because the risk is too high. Even just giving up the executive power for a number of months, a few months, is coming with the risk of putting criminals behind bars. And he himself might be involved in many criminal activities, but definitely his family and very close collaborators are. If they, you know, even on a plea bargain, for example, they start revealing secrets. So far, you know, a significant number of Fidesz top-level politicians and even Orban's family could go behind bars. So he's not risking this, believe me. No, there's no such risk as Orban deliberately losing the election. No, he's intent on keeping power, of course, forever.
Thank you, Peter. Michal, I have a question for you. How do you see the role of the European Parliament if perhaps in April, Fidesz or after April, Fidesz were to contest constitutional change with reference to EU law, or if it were to challenge the Hungarian election results?
Yes, I mean, I've listened, and it's a fascinating discussion. I mean, I think there is some expectation already that that Orban will kind of you know, do a Trump and contest the elections, especially if they're close. My sense is that, of course, if the facts are clear, and if you know, if the case is solid, I mean, I would be hugely surprised if the European Parliament, or you know, the majority in the European Parliament kind of bought that, you know, any claim of elections being falsified or by Orban if in case he loses. So here I'm pretty confident that the European Parliament, you know, will not buy this and will not fall into that trap, as it were. What I'm kind of thinking about, and also listening to you, is how the EU and the European Commission in particular will approach the situation after the elections, should the opposition win by a simple majority, and should Mr. Márki-Zay sort of push through his you know, vision of how things should unfold, and how, you know, Orban's illiberal and non-democratic regime should be dismantled. And here, I think what's needed, and I really hope that the Commission will start to precisely treat the situation in context, because it is true that if you follow, as Professor Sayo has said, if you follow kind of a very legalistic conception of rule of law, that yes, there might be people who would contest that, and there might be people who would, you know, find fault in Hungary's new majority pursuit of, you know, declaring the constitution or declaring the Constitutional Court illegitimate, or basically declaring all the steps by Orban, or some of the steps by Orban, unconstitutional. And I really hope, and I kind of, my sense is that the Commission is gradually moving toward a more contextualized view of these things, in which, and this is something that the Parliament has been pushing for, and myself, that you need to view these situations, as in Poland, as in Hungary, not just through, you know, the legal prism of the rule of law, but also in the context of democracy and fundamental rights, and Article 2 as a whole. And slowly I can see that even that the Commission is tending toward that view more and more. And if this paradigm is applied, then I think also that I think it would be also good from the perspective of the new, hopefully new majority in Hungary, that the European Union will take a more holistic view, and therefore all the debate and all the dilemmas, which I understand are hard, the European Union could also understand and certainly I hope that in the Parliament we will, because we're a political body, we would see all of these things in a political context. I think in the end, for the EU, regardless of now of Hungary, beyond Hungary, this is absolutely crucial that we start, seeing an erosion of democracy and a buildup of authoritarian practices. We see it as that, and not some legal problem which must have the same strict legal remedy. So here I'm somewhat hopeful. Certainly, the conversation has shifted from a couple of years ago, where rule of law was really something just strictly legalese.
Sure, thank you. Peter, I've got a question for you here. Lawyers like András Jakab, say there's no need for changing two-thirds laws with a simple majority because that might actually worsen the situation in Hungary. How do you respond to that?
Well, there are lots of interesting ideas, but I would normally stick to principles. So, for example, there is a debate, and I explained it at the beginning too. There is a debate within the opposition. How far can we go, and what is the right solution? And some suggest, and it's a significant number of people or parties actually, that we should, for example, tax those, the wealth that was stolen. And I don't believe that taxing thieves would be either legal or would be moral. I think taxing, rich people, poor people is one thing, but criminals should be apprehended, brought to justice, and put behind bars. And it's two very different approaches. So anybody who's suggesting to treat such problems by circumventing them is probably not according to my taste, at least. So this is probably the most important point. We need to stick to principles. And I agree with everybody whom I heard today on this discussion. That we have to stick to the spirit of the law and not to the letter of the law, because the letter, right now and at the beginning, the professor explained that Orbán used the law to his, goals to execute his goals, and this is really not. We should not fall into this trap either.
Thank you, András. I would also like to put that question to you, to hear your thoughts on that.
Could you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, that lawyers like András Jakab, who have said that there's no need to change these two-thirds laws with a simple majority because doing that would worsen the situation in Hungary. How do you feel about that?
Well, the situation is such that lawyers pretend to be political scientists and political scientists pretend to be lawyers. And now you would like to force me to share this illustrious company. All I can say is that this is something that will become clear only after the elections. I personally don't have enough information. I don't know what is, for example, in certain tax reports. I really don't know what is in international treaties concerning the nuclear power station, or I don't have access to information regarding how specific public procurement deals were cut. So once you know more about that, you will see whether within the simple majority laws you have enough opportunity, not necessarily to put people into jail, but to initiate proper legal procedure. But here again, some people will say that there will be no proper legal procedure, even with those evidence in hands of the government, because you need a prosecutor to press a charge. So that's where the practical difficulties lie at the moment. But again, I'm just a lawyer who can tell you a lot about what happened in the past. And the last thing I am qualified to tell you what will happen in the future.
Thank you.
Kim? Can I say something quickly? Yeah, so I want to support
Sure.
András in saying that, one of the things you get when you come into power may not be the power to change all the laws, but it will be the power to look into all the files that remain. And that will give the opposition government, when it comes into power, a lot of evidence and information that they can use going forward. And if the public prosecutor's office is not cooperating in actually bringing prosecutions, there are two avenues they can use, right? One is to join the European Public Prosecutor's Office and turn over the files to them where it pertains to EU related matters. But the other thing, and this is what Hungary used very successfully in the last transition, after 1989, which is to go public with information about individuals and what they did in the last regime, which may not be criminal prosecution, but it's very powerful. And that leads me to agree with something that András Jakob has said in some of his other public comments, which is, again, if we look back on 89-90, that transition would not have been possible if it were not for the fact that a lot of people who held up the prior regime were opportunists and they were happy to uphold the new regime, which is to say a lot of people who look like they are defending an indefensible regime will see the light as soon as their own personal conditions change. In other words, transitions depend on opportunists, and we don't yet know how many of them there are. András Jakob thinks there are quite a few of them. I think that's probably true. So one thing that may happen is that a lot of the barriers that we now see to the administration of a spirit of law may actually disappear as the regimes actually change.
Thank you for that. I'm going to ask one final question here from Michal, and then I'm going to put some questions from the audience to you all. Michal, the European Union has developed no shortage of instruments and mechanisms and tools in the toolbox for dealing with rule of law issues. How do you think this rule of law conditionality will be profoundly different from some of the instruments we've seen in the past?
The short answer is yes, and it already is profoundly different, even though it hasn't been activated because of this political deal from December 2020. I think it is profoundly different, and assuming that the European Court of Justice dismisses the action by Hungary and Poland to have this strike down, so it will be, as it already is, law, but it will be applied. I think it definitely has the potential to be a game changer in the EU toolbox when it comes to rule of law. Obviously, it's already in a way being applied by, although not this particular piece of legislation, but by the fact that the Commission is withholding the approval of the recovery plans by Hungary and Poland. In a way, it's though perhaps not legally this instrument, it is in that context that this is withheld. And I mean, from my perspective, it's of course unfortunate that it has come to this, that we have to use this measure of last resort as a European Union. But on the other hand, as everybody sees, and is patently obvious, all of the other options have been exhausted, and there has been dialogue for years and years, and things got even worse in both Hungary and Poland. So my hope is that this instrument, together with obviously others, Article 7, and monitoring and infringement, and perhaps even systemic and strategic infringement, all of that combined, if we use it properly, then that, yes, that could be the beginning of the EU turning ahead of events rather than chasing events or chasing trends in this area. So yes.
Thank you. We have a question here. András Jakob has made some compelling points about the limits of formalistic, legalistic approach to law. The tricky part is that very similar rhetoric was used by those who defend judicial reforms in Poland. Are we going to be inconsistent then?
May I
yeah,
answer that? So look, the factual basis is different, and many people are not concerned with facts, not if they interfere with their beliefs. In this case, remember what was the argument in Poland, that after 30 years, the same judiciary is in place, and that requires a reform, that the communist judges are determining the situation, determine the judgments in Poland. Now, this is a ridiculous argument. There were maybe 8 people who were actually pinpointed by them among several thousand judges. Now, if you compare that kind of argument with the argument that can be made regarding the Orbán government, and it's not me who is making those arguments, these are findings of the European Parliament, the Commission, and what's not. It's very different from a factual basis established by independent bodies from what the Polish government claimed. And I think the parallel ends with the facts. So I don't think that this is like the argument made by the Polish government and in particular the Minister of Justice.
Thank you. I know that Peter has to leave soon. He's got a very busy schedule. We have a question for you, Peter. Have you considered a big constitutional convention similar to the Chilean one? You're muted. Can't hear you. You're muted.
Oh, sorry for that. Yes. So this is not my job, as I'm not the jurist, but yes, I outsourced this job to a group of jurists led by Flex Zoltán. And I think this is an interesting proposal already. Some others already suggested a similar convention, if you want, here within Hungary, but it might actually be a matter of interest for international experts as well. And I already learned a lot from this discussion, and thank you very much. It was, again, as a layman, for me, that was a very interesting discussion, and hearing especially Kim's arguments about the European law's precedence over Hungarian law gives us another avenue that we might pursue.
Thank you, Peter. And one final question before you leave: have you received any response from Prime Minister Orbán's office about a possible debate date?
Well, officially, they answered that they are not open to such discussions. They came up with different explanations why. One was, of course, the usual Gyurcsány text that, I'm just an employee. I'm just a subordinate of the real boss, Gyurcsány. Not that Mr. Orbán is willing to have a discussion or a debate with Mr. Gyurcsány. So it's not a legitimate argument. Some young supporters already corrected some of these billboard advertisements, which portray me and Mr. Gyurcsány. Now they changed the heads on these billboards to Mr. Putin and Mr. Orbán. So of course, that could be another explanation. But anyway, I believe that if many Fidesz supporters will also request such a debate between the two of us, then he might change his mind. So let's hope so.
All right. Thank you, Peter, for joining us today. And I am going to pass along the mic here to
thank you, bye.
Thank you, Peter. Goodbye.
Bye.
Who will make some closing remarks here before we wind up.
Thank you very much, Ben, and thank you very much for all participants of the panel. This was really a wonderful show. Special thanks are due to László Bruce, the co-director of DI, and Dmitry Kochanov, who is the leader of the Rule of Law Group, together with Michal of the Review of Democracy, for their vision and perseverance for making the event happen. I would also like to thank, on behalf of all of us, the wonderful Robert Németh, who made the Zoom call and the live streaming possible. You will be able to rewatch the debate on Facebook immediately, and we will post the recording as soon as we can on the DI's YouTube channel. Thank you very much for joining us today.